I made up my mind a while back that I love my country enough to whether or not it can be saved or can't be saved, I'm here for the fight. I am here for the fight. I'll go down with the ship.
And it didn't really have to do with Donald Trump, although it wouldn't have happened without him, of course. But it had to do with the complete rejection of a entertainment and news media that has become dishonest, corrupt, leftist in the worst possible sense of that word, and that it's ideological. It's not just bad ideology, but it's rigid ideology. And they did everything, they threw everything they could at him, but they forgot that a new media had grown up and it had really exposed them. The new media doesn't have the reporting power that the old media has. It certainly doesn't have the distribution power of Hollywood, but it does have the ability now to expose them and what they're doing every step of the way. So no matter what they did, and I've always compared what we were doing to the American Revolution, sort of popping up behind the rocks and taking a shot at this empire coming, marching in rows. But that's exactly what we did. Every time they came out with another lie, we exposed it. And once Elon Musk got in the game and once X turned over, it really, you could feel the tide shifting. And the fact that they rejected, Trump, who's Adolf Hitler, who's a convicted felon, who's the worst person on earth, the fact that they reelected him just showed that we won. We won that battle. And that means that the field is open to creatives. It means the field is open to journalists, and culture commentators. And the question now is, we've done the negative work of exposing them. Will we do the positive work of building the infrastructure we need to have a real culture?
That is always harder, it seems to me, for conservatives. It's hard enough leaning on Edmund Burke here for conservatives to sustain a governing majority, actually just a governing coalition. And obviously when he made that observation, he was thinking about a period 230, 40 years ago. But I also think about his native land today, where the conservatives were in power, capital C conservatives were in power for 14 years. And with each passing year in the political and policy realm, they actually became more like the radical left. And so it isn't just that the left has marched through the institutions, as Gramsci said, it's that they marched through our conservative political institutions themselves. Believe it or not, in spite of that long throat clearing, it's related to what you just said, which is that we have to always be leaning forward, always be on offense, especially now that we have the advantage with, as you say, the new media. What do we need to do? Like, people in the audience who, of course, have very important roles, whatever they're doing, wherever they are, but maybe they're not in DC. What can they be doing individually to make sure that we press the advantage?
Well, for one thing, and this is something a drum I've been beating for over 20 years, is we need to build a cultural infrastructure. We have none. We have think tanks all over the place. They deal with very specialized things. They deal with municipal, governance. They deal with legal theory and all this stuff. We don't have a single think tank that deals with the culture. But just before he died, one of the last conversations I had with Andrew Breitbart, who was famous for making that comment repeatedly that politics is downstream from culture, he asked me, would you head a cultural institute? Now, I think I'm probably the worst person to ask that question, but I jumped at the chance, not because I thought I would be any good at it, but because I thought we need that so desperately. Artists work for love. If you ever look at the people in Hollywood, they make movie after movie, left-wing movie after movie that bombs. Their movies bomb. All the movies against the wars on terror, they all bombed. All the leftist movies bombed. If you look at the movies that have just been nominated for Academy Awards, movies about transgenderism, about sex work, as they now call it, about brutalist architecture, no one went to see them, but they just nominate them because that's where the prestige is, that's where the love is, that's where the girls are, and that's where you're going to get the big award and get this. Show your mom you stood up on TV and made a speech. We have nothing like that. We don't even have an award for like the best, conservative work that came out, let alone just work that we like, So artists get no love from us. They get, people are always saying to me, I don't have to go to the movies. I can watch Turner Classics. And I think, well, great, but don't expect anybody to make any movies that you're going to want to watch now, And so we haven't got the infrastructure for artists. We haven't got the funding for artists. Artists need grants sometimes. They need support. And we haven't got and because of all that, we haven't got the culture that's required to welcome artists.
I have felt for a long time, perhaps my whole career, really, that we are at the end of an era. And by that I mean it's like several hundred years worth of Western civilization are kind of coming to a close. And one of the things that can be actually quite frustrating, I think, for political people as well, is that you can see that happening long before it makes an impact on an election. And this Trump victory, this sweep, this kind of red wave, felt like a long, long time in coming on so many different levels. At a media level, the fact that we've been living in this totally transformed ecosystem for so long, and we've been doing these podcasts, and we've been building an alternate media world, and just didn't feel like we had broken the power of the New York Times or CNN and MSNBC. Suddenly, everything, all that has changed, and it is like the frog in the pot, or like the earthquake that builds up under the ground. In much the same way, I think we are going through a cultural transformation, which, in some ways, my book is actually about. That has to do with the end of materialism, the end of modernity in its most pernicious forms, and the start of something I think much more exciting, possibly a spiritual revival, people realizing that they need something more than just material satisfaction to be happy and to live a good life. All of that has been in the works for a while, but the Trump election kind of manifested in this very dramatic way.
Is one way of putting that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so correct me if I'm mistaken, one way to put that tens of millions of American voters, although some of them use a different vocabulary than what you and I might use, are acknowledging that's the case, and that they are, and here's the thing I'm positing that might be a little shaky, that they're actually ahead of the curve. They sense that, they feel it, they know it before the so-called intelligentsia on the East Coast has figured it out.
I think that's a really interesting way of putting it. Yeah, I mean, you may know this, that between this past October and the October before that, so 1 year, Bible sales are up by something like 22%. And I think that, this does not betoken like a mass return to churches. It's not like people are suddenly accepting the Nicene Creed like in every point, but it does indicate something profound about the instincts of the American people. I mean, this is something that the most perceptive observers of America have commented on throughout history. De Tocqueville talks about this. G.K. Chesterton talks about the nation with the soul of a church. And a lot of times when we talk about realignment, it can get very complicated. It's a big buzzword, who's voting where, and, Latinos shift this many points to the right, or, young black men maybe. But really what I think we're talking about is where normalcy lies. This was a big cultural thing in the election. Who's weird, who's normal? And in some ways, I think normalcy, despite what you may see on the news, normalcy really does remain in America with this kind of core instinct of patriotism, religious belief. These are things that people still feel the need for very strongly. And yeah, politics kind of lags behind that in some ways. And
so to drill down just one step below that, and then we'll get into your book specifically, it seems as if that's the case, and I agree with you, that the election in many respects turned on which side was more normal, or which side would return America to something more like normal. The broader cultural context, not just over the last years and decades, but maybe centuries, is, that the implications of postmodernism, the implications of this hyper-materialism, where in the United States, because of the success of our market system, we've experienced more than any other developed country.
Yes.
That Americans are saying some of that's good, like we like material security, but some of this we understand there to be a connection to the abnormal things we're experiencing, whether it's with people with kids, or whether it's just even people without kids who are experiencing the deterioration of cultural institutions. And interestingly, it seems as if the presidential election was influenced by this.
Absolutely.
And that's remarkably hopeful.
It certainly is.
But on that point, it seems as if one facet of not beating ourselves over the head with a hammer about the presidential election would be, it really came down to common sense. It really came down to a majority of Americans saying, one side is telling me that X is Y, that grocery prices haven't gone up, that boys are girls and girls are boys. And really, ultimately, what the Trump campaign did in the last part of it was just say, trust what you know to be true. So in other words, in spite of all of the efforts by one side to tell us that truth isn't truth, that there are multiple truths, that you can still trust the American people to pursue truth and to pursue the American dream.
Yeah, thank goodness. I was so proud of the Democrat voters that came across, the independent voters that came across, the minority voters that had never voted ever, a lot of times at all, much less for a conservative. They're the reason he won. Yeah, the base, Trump's base showed up, we showed up, but without them showing up, man, they'd still be counting votes in Pennsylvania, even though they are to a certain degree.
They're trying.
For the president, they would still be doing that, and they were unable to do it because so many people, and now they just can't understand why we weren't able to brainwash these people. I don't understand how else should we have said it to fool them into giving us 4 more years. Isn't it something to see the curtain get ripped back on them, and they're just standing there with, Mika and Joe standing there like fools, and they just can't understand why we couldn't talk them into it again. And I go, well, you know what? Because people only have a certain threshold of pain. That's why.
It's human nature.
And when that pain level gets high enough, they don't care what you tell them. All they know is this hurts, and I want it to stop.
Yeah.
And that's why they picked Trump.
Humility comes from many sources. And what I learned back when I was a professor, and I certainly learned it in what I'm doing now, is that the radical left always overreaches. They always overplay their hand. Now, sometimes we have to endure a lot of pain. We, on the right, have to endure a lot of pain, and we have in the last few years under their administration, but they ultimately overplay their hand. One of the things that doesn't always happen, however, is that the right decides they're going to call them. Too often, especially in DC and some state capitals, the political right, conservative politicians, or at least politicians who purport to be conservatives, decide they aren't going to match them. And I think what Trump in particular is teaching us, but even J.D. Vance, who's got a different personality but the same resolve, is stand up to him. And stand up to him.
Bullies hate that.
Exactly. They hate it on the schoolyard. They hate it in politics. And I guess I'm just hopeful that between their example and the truth of what you just said about the American dream, that tens of millions of Americans who've sort of been sitting on the sidelines don't just say, I voted in the last election for the right side, but that I want to participate in rebuilding my country.
I think at the end of this 4 years, if Trump has delivered, and I believe he will, I don't think you lose any of those voters. As a matter of fact, I think you pick up even more of them. The ones that were on the fence going, I don't know, and they wind up voting the other way. And their friends are like, okay, watch what's going to happen. They're going to see life improve.
Yeah.
And then I think you have even more. I think the left has a real problem right now because the word is traveling through those circles of people that never voted conservative. And it's a real conversation. I mean, for real. Yeah. A lot of my friends, even in the music industry, who aren't struggling or anything like that, even especially the creatives that saw how much censorship was coming down. For instance, comedians I'm friends with having to pick and choose what jokes they're going to say because they don't want to get kicked off of Netflix, don't want to lose their special, whatever. And they're like, these are like Bernie Sanders supporters, some of these people. And they said, I'm going to have to vote for Trump. I said, you're kidding me. You are voting for Trump. I'm going to have to. Why? Because this is not America. It's not freedom of speech. I cannot deal with this anymore. I mean, that's how far out they got that Bernie Sanders supporters were voting for Trump. But freedom, I don't think freedom has a party. I really don't.
No,
freedom is a human thing. I'm just a human being. Leave me alone and let me do what I want to do.
It's bigger than both parties.
It's bigger than all. It's bigger than the whole thing. Yeah, exactly right.
We're in a new moment. We're at the beginning. We don't have as much time, perhaps. We may not have decades, but we're at the beginning of the hard work of thinking and analyzing and persuading our fellow Americans about this new moment. We're facing China. The Soviet Union no longer even exists. We have technology which could lead to wonders and economic growth of the kind we haven't experienced yet, but could also be used and is being used in China to impose the kind of surveillance of which the KGB could never even have dreamed. And on it goes. We are in a new moment, and it feels to me that the hard work is just beginning, but is very urgent.
I agree with all of that, actually. And sometimes I get asked the question, often by members of the media, some of them from more or less right of center, politically speaking, outlets like the Wall Street Journal, why is it, for example, this is related to your question, why is it, for example, that heritage is quote unquote leaving Reaganism behind? And I mean, that nothing could.
So how do you answer that?
Nothing could be further from the truth. But your question reminded me of that. And what's interesting for me, and I'll talk about our institutional response, but personally, having basically been raised by two of the first proponents for Ronald Reagan in Louisiana, my grandparents, both of them Marine Corps veterans, they literally would have taken a bullet for Ronald Reagan. And I remember even before he was elected president, listening to the radio addresses. And I mean, both of my grandparents, but particularly my grandmother, revered him. She was from Illinois, so she sort of felt this connection to him. And all of that to say, for my generation, Generation X, who have great fondness and appreciation for Ronald Reagan, two things can be true at once. This is, for example, what I try to explain to our friends at the Wall Street Journal. We recently had a wonderful, wide-ranging conversation about this point. Two things can be true. What I just said, this fondness, appreciation, this permanent legacy of Reagan, and this other thing which you touched on, which is America's different in 2024. I wish Reagan were around today to help lead us through this, navigate it, or at least whisper some advice in our ears. But all of that to say, we can apply what we've learned from Reagan's leadership, certainly apply the principles that he revitalized the application of. But I think he would also, tell me if you think I'm mistaken, implore us to recognize the 2020s are different.
Absolutely.
And in particular, to make a little bit of what sounds like a pessimistic note, but it's more realistic because I'm ultimately hopeful about everything. America's a lot weaker today than it was in the 1980s. And I never thought that I would say that because I remember doing, quote unquote, tornado drills in the 1980s, but they were really nuclear drills. Like we're going to be saved by putting our heads under a desk, right? That the United States would never ultimately prevail over the Soviet Union, which we did just later that decade because of Reagan and Bush. But to continue the thought, I think that the United States today, in terms of socioeconomic metrics, our military strength, even our moral authority around the world, as I travel much of the world waving the heritage flag, all of that's weaker. But Reagan also proved that that can be true and it can be reversed. And so I think to kind of get to a punchline here, Peter, that we have a lot of things still to learn from Reagan. One of the things we try to do here at Heritage is acknowledge, especially to our friends on the right, the so-called new right, we understand why you're saying that maybe we, quote unquote, talk about Reagan too much. I get what you're saying. What they're really saying is not that they don't appreciate the man. They don't appreciate that maybe the movement hasn't moved on to confront the realities of the 2020s. But I also say, guys, that doesn't mean you need to forsake what we've learned from him. And I actually think, to conclude on a positive note here, in the last 6, 9, 12 months, there's been real progress there, just within the political right, even though we've got some fratricide, it seems like sometimes.
Kevin, do you mean to tell me that our side is making progress?
I am.
What?
It's all supposed to be bad, Peter. I know this.
I know. The world
but don't you see that progress yourself?
Yeah.
We're not there yet because, as you said, it really is the beginning of something new. It's the beginning of what I call the new conservative movement, which, I should be clear, I don't think has any new principles. I don't think we have the power to do that. These principles are immutable. But the application of those principles based on the different realities that we're facing, I think Reagan would implore us to get busy about.
Absolutely right.
Thomas Massey tweeted out, I think a couple weeks ago, he goes, I don't know if the country can be saved, but I'm here in case we can. And there's some people that will look at that and be like, well, that's inappropriate for a man of his position and prominence to say something. Well, he's being honest with you. And if there's one thing Thomas Massey is every single time, it's honest.
100% of the time.
100% of the time. And he's also courageous, I would argue. But here's what I would say. I made up my mind a while back that I love my country enough to whether or not it can be saved or can't be saved, I'm here for the fight. I am here for the fight. I'll go down with the ship. And the reason why I think it's so important for us to have that mentality is because I think it's the only one that actually can save us. If the only way you're willing to work to save it is if you can be guaranteed of success, then not only will you not win, you don't deserve to. because nobody who built this country initially was guaranteed that. And all of the smart money was on them losing, and they did it anyways. So this is the hill I die on. And I not only want the people that I'm fighting alongside to know that that's my level of commitment. I want the people that want to destroy us to also know it's my level of commitment. If you want this country, you will have to go through me. And now my job is to make that as difficult as possible.
God bless you for your courage. What's next for you?
You know, I think when Buckley said that politics is downstream from culture, it's become something of a cliche, but I think it's true. I think politics is incredibly important, and I'm very, very thankful for. I mean, look, I've dedicated a large part of my life to it, and I'm, going to be going right back into General Assembly next year to do the same thing. I've always been very grateful for Heritage for doing the same, but the thing that encourages me the most is the fight for the culture. And I don't think that means, I mean, if you read anything about Antonio Gramsci and his idea of the march through the institutions and the way they were going to finally take down the West and make it Marxist, was not going to be exclusively through politics. It was going to be through all the culturally shaping institutions, education, media, arts and entertainment. I'm starting to see more and more people take that fight seriously and really go after it. And then ultimately it's the family. So what I will continue, I will fight the political fight as best I can with the understanding that that battle has to be fought. We can't accept giving ground there. But this is all about actually building up the culturally shaping institutions, beginning with the family. And I would say next into the whole idea of, that primary level of educational years. I think the more competition I see in that environment, the more optimistic I become about winning this. Like I said, if we're really serious and we do it right, we're one generation away from turning it around. One generation away. If you spend too much time focusing on the political and then all of your kids go off and vote the complete opposite of the way you did, something went wrong.
What have you achieved?
Something went wrong. And here's the best part. A lot of the political fights you have to fight, and they're not fun. They're not. I mean, I love spending time with my kids. I love spending time with my wife and my other co-hosts when we talk about cultural things and studying history and delving into those important questions and about ideas and history. I love when you when you hear like a talented entertainer or comedian just take the edge off the day with that humor. Right? These are all the things that are fun. And if you want to be a happy warrior, then you got to do the happy things too. And the good news is that a lot of the things that are the most worth fighting for are also the ones that will provide you the most sense of meaning, purpose, and fun and gratification. So don't treat the whole thing like just a political slog. Fight in those other areas, and you will find that gives you not only the strength, but also the rest and the respite you sometimes need as well to get up and fight the other battles, which aren't so fun. So that's what I'll continue to do. I love the cultural fight, and I mean that in the most basic terms of fighting for the ideas which shape a family, a community, and ultimately a nation.
The Kevin Roberts Show is brought to you by more than 10 million supporters of the Heritage Foundation. The executive producer is Crystal Kate Bonham. Sound design by Lauren Evans, Mark Guiney, Tim Kennedy, and Joseph Fonspakowski. For more information and to subscribe, please visit heritage.org.